Tay, they were taken in the night. Some were dragged from their homes. Others were deceived by merchants' smiles and promises of trade. But the result was always the same: shackled, branded, beaten, loaded like cargo onto ships, marched in chains across blistering deserts, or sold into foreign lands where their names, identities, and histories were stripped away like bark from a tree. For many, death was a mercy that came too soon or too late. For the rest, life would be a quiet torment, lived in the shadows of empires that claimed to bring civilization, but left only ruin in the souls of millions. Long before the rise of Adolf Hitler and the atrocities of the 20th century, there was another Holocaust, one history rarely dares to name, one not etched into monuments or echoed in books, one that spanned over 1,000 years and claimed the lives, dignity, and future of countless Africans: the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades, orchestrated and sustained by various Islamic caliphates and sultanates from the 7th century onward. This is not a story of hatred toward a people or faith. It is a story of power, conquest, and the devastating human cost of empire, a story where victims were silenced by sand and sea, their bones lost to time, their legacy almost erased. But we remember them now, not in blame, but in truth. Because truth is the first step toward justice. In the heart of the African continent, from the verdant valleys of the Niger to the gold-rich plains of Mali, kingdoms once thrived. These were proud civilizations with sophisticated governments, art, trade networks, and spiritual traditions. Black life was not only present, it was powerful. But that power drew the eye of foreign ambitions. When Arab armies swept across North Africa in the 7th century, bringing with them the banner of Islam, they were not merely bringing faith, they were bringing empire. And empires require labor, obedience, and dominance. The Quran, in its essence, offered a vision of equality and compassion. But as with so many religious texts throughout history, it was often weaponized by rulers for expansion and control. Slavery had existed long before Islam, of course. But under the Umayyads, Abbasids, and later Ottoman caliphates, the system became industrialized. While European ships had not yet begun crossing the Atlantic in search of slaves, caravans had already been moving through Africa for centuries, carrying men, women, and children north through the Sahara and east toward the Indian Ocean. They were called Zanj, a term used to describe black Africans, particularly those from East Africa. Too many caliphs and sultans, the Zanj, were not human in the way their own citizens were. They were not equals. They were laborers, concubines, soldiers, and servants. Their skin color marked them as inferior, their bodies as tools. Some were castrated to prevent them from fathering children. Others were worked to death in salt mines under the blazing sun, their sweat seeping into the earth as mute testimony to a forgotten genocide. Historians estimate that as many as 17 million Africans were enslaved in this system over the centuries. Though some argue the true number may be far higher, many more died en route. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, where male labor was prized for plantation, slave work, the Islamic slave trade skewed heavily toward female captives, often desired for their beauty, their silence, their forced compliance. Generations of African women were taken not for fields, but for harems. Their stories, Their pain rarely appear in the archives. But there is one story that refuses to be buried, the story of the Zanj Rebellion. It was the 9th century, in what is now southern Iraq, in the vast marshlands near Basra. Thousands of East African slaves had been brought there by Arab landowners to drain the swamps and toil in salt fields. They labored under unthinkable conditions, many having been castrated to ensure their obedience. Beatings were routine, food was scarce, and for decades the suffering endured in silence. Until one day, a voice rose among them. His name was Ali ibn Muhammad, a Persian mystic and revolutionary. He promised not just freedom, but dignity. He preached justice, vengeance, and a return to humanity. And the Zanj listened. In 869 CE, they rose in rebellion. It was not a fleeting riot, it was a full-scale war. For nearly 15 years, the Zanj rebels fought against the might of the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the most powerful empires in the world. They captured cities, defeated armies, and established their own capital. For a moment in history, African slaves stood as kings and commanders. Their struggle terrified the elite and inspired the oppressed. It was one of the largest and most successful slave uprisings in recorded history, too. But history, as we know, favors the victors. The Abbasids eventually crushed the rebellion, slaughtering tens of thousands and reasserting control. Ali ibn Muhammad was killed, and the dream of freedom was buried with him. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the Zanj Rebellion faded, intentionally erased by those who found it too inconvenient, too damning. Still, the rebellion stands as proof. The enslaved were never passive. They resisted, they dreamed, they organized. They bled not just in chains, but in battle. And even in defeat, they left behind a legacy of courage that could not be silenced. And so we return to the broader tragedy. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which has been widely studied and memorialized, the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trades remain shrouded in shadows. The absence of documentation was not an accident. In many Islamic societies, slave populations were often absorbed without record. Children of slaves were often cut off from their African heritage, forcibly assimilated into Arab, Persian, or Turkish culture. Intergenerational identity was not preserved, it was erased. No Emancipation Proclamation marked the end of their bondage. No civil rights movement rose to demand justice for their descendants. Even today, in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, racial hierarchies rooted in this ancient system still persist, where the darkest skin often carries the deepest scars of historical contempt. Amid the silence, we find flickers of pride, stories passed down by griots and grandmothers, songs sung in Swahili on the shores of Oman, the strength of the Haritin in Mauritania, who carry their ancestry with dignity, the bravery of Afro-Iraqis, who trace their lineage to the Zanj and demand recognition in a world that has tried to forget them. This is not a story meant to pit one group against another. It is a story that asks us to remember the full truth of human history, to honor the suffering and resilience of Black lives across centuries and continents, to resist the temptation of silence, especially when that silence was designed to erase. And in that remembering, there is power. For centuries, Black bodies were bartered in the markets of Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, Zanzibar, and Istanbul. Their labor built palaces, irrigated fields, and fueled dynasties that praised themselves for culture and refinement. But their voices, those of the enslaved, were smothered beneath sand, denied the ink of scribes, kept from the scrolls of history. And yet they endured. It is a cruel irony that many of those who suffered this silent Holocaust died without even knowing the word Africa. For they were stolen so young, so completely, that their own homeland became myth. A generation passed into another, born in captivity, raised to believe that servitude was fate, that blackness was a burden. In Islamic texts and cultural traditions of the time, pseudoscientific ideas about race began to emerge, some theologians and jurists claiming Africans were destined for slavery because of the curse of Ham, a grotesque misinterpretation borrowed and twisted through generations. Such beliefs did not reflect the spirit of Islam as a faith, but they were wielded by those in power to justify the trade, to silence conscience, and to dehumanize millions. Canned. What of those who survived? Some rose in the courts of sultans as eunuchs, warriors, or administrators. Figures like Malik Amber in India, former Ethiopian slave who rose to become a military genius and regent of the Ahmadnagar Sultanate, proved that black brilliance could not be extinguished. But for every Amber, there were thousands who died faceless, buried in unmarked graves across the Middle East, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent. One might ask, why has this story been so forgotten? Because the world often prefers its villains to be white, its genocides to be neat, and its narratives to be comfortable. The Atlantic slave trade fits a clearer mold: colonial greed, European cruelty, abolitionist redemption. But this older, longer, and in many ways even more insidious system refuses such simplicity. It cuts across faiths, across centuries, across continents. It challenges the idea that suffering has borders, or that injustice wears only one face. East Africa. The island of Zanzibar was once the beating heart of the Indian Ocean slave trade. Arab traders like Tipu Tip grew rich by capturing Africans from the interior and selling them abroad. For those who passed through Zanzibar's markets, the next stop might be Mecca, Cairo, Muscator, a graveyard beneath the waves. So many perished on dhows crossing the Indian Ocean that sailors spoke of slave fish, sharks that learned to follow the ships, feeding on those thrown overboard. To walk the old slave route from Bagamoyo to Zanzibar today is to walk on bones. To hear the wind through mangrove trees is to hear the echoes of 1,000 songs of mourning. But there are no tourist brochures, no UNESCO plaques, no museums filled with artifacts of sorrow and resistance. Just silence, broken only by the memories carried in the blood of descendants who still feel the weight of chains in their dreams. And still, they endured. In Oman, Afro-Omanis whisper their history, even as many face discrimination and denial of their past. In Iraq, Afro-Iraqis still battle for civil rights, recognition, and the right to speak their language of origin, now long vanished. Caths. In Saudi Arabia, black domestic workers continue to experience conditions eerily similar to slavery, under a system that echoes the exploitations of the past. In Sudan, Mauritania, Libya, modern slavery still exists, its roots tangled in centuries of racial hierarchy and inherited trauma. The past never truly passed. It lingers in skin and surname. It Echoes in how the world treats black refugees from the Horn of Africa, how little outrage is reserved for their suffering, how rarely their humanity is centered in global discourse. And yet, among all this, there is light. There is pride, not just in survival, but in resurgence. Young African historians, writers, and activists are reclaiming these lost stories, breathing life into voices once silenced. Afro-Arab descendants are speaking out, demanding visibility and justice. Documentaries, novels, and oral histories are breaking ground that textbooks left barren for centuries. Because these stories matter, not to shame, but to restore, not to accuse, but to heal, not to divide, but to remember and, in remembering, to do better. And so we ask, what does justice look like for a genocide the world barely acknowledges? There are no Nuremberg trials for the victims of the Trans-Saharan slave trade, no reparations, no formal apologies. But there can be truth, there can be light. There can be a reweaving of memory that refuses to let the suffering remain forgotten. To say their names is to resurrect their dignity. To tell their stories is to return their humanity. And to understand their struggle is to better understand the strength and resilience that defines Black life not just in America, but across the world. Because theirs was not a story of passive victimhood. It was a story of stolen children who became rebels, of concubines who became queens in spirit, of men who died chained, yet dreamed of open skies. It was a story of people who were broken but never erased. And it is a story that belongs to us all. Imagine a child, today curious, bright-skinned, full of questions, asking where their ancestors came from. Not just the ones who crossed the Atlantic, but the ones whose bones rest beneath desert sands, whose stories were scattered by wind and empire. What will we tell them? We must tell them that their ancestors were not forgotten, they were taken. That their pain was not erased, it was hidden. That their worth was never in question, it was denied by those too afraid to see their brilliance. And most importantly, we must tell them that in every drop of their blood is the strength of millions who refuse to die quietly. They are the children of kings and rebels, of warriors and mothers who endured the unendurable. Their history does not begin in chains, it begins in greatness, interrupted by brutality, but never destroyed. And today, with every story told, with every silence broken, we stitch another thread back into the great tapestry of truth. This is the legacy of the forgotten Holocaust before Hitler. This is the memory we must protect. This is the justice we owe not just to the past, but to the future. Let us not look away. Let us not forget. Let us speak their names, and in doing so, give them back the dignity that was stolen.